Welcome to Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson. An explosion in Pakistan killed 41 this morning. The Taliban promises more. Revenge for a U.S. missile strike in August that killed one of their top leaders. White House War Council meetings were already tough enough. How does this affect the president's search for military policy in the region? To discuss the latest, I'm joined by CBS News Washington Bureau Chief Chris Isham and Vanity Fair columnist Christopher Hitchens. Chris Isham, I want to start with you. 4 attacks in a week. What's going on in Pakistan?
Well, clearly this shows that the Taliban have quite a substantial capability in the ability to mount these major suicide attacks and bombings throughout the country. It's a real message that they're trying to send to the government, not only for retaliation, as you mentioned, but also I think they are trying to send a message in advance of an anticipated attack that the Pakistani army is planning in South Waziristan, which is the headquarters of many of the foreign fighters like Al-Qaeda and for the hardcore of the Taliban. So they're trying to prevent that, I think, in a way of, as this is kind of a shot across the bow, letting Pakistan know what they're capable of, that they can cause mass casualties and many, many deaths in these kinds of attacks. And we'll see whether this causes the Pakistani government or the Pakistani people to take another look at whether or not they should be going forward into the tribal areas.
Christopher, assess that for me. The people and the military, how fragile are they to this kind of onslaught by the Taliban?
Well, you'll note also that this is the week where the Pakistani authorities and media are complaining bitterly that Congress is trying to attach any riders or conditions to the really very generous amounts of aid that we have been giving them more or less unchecked for a very long time. I call your attention to the fact that the Taliban, or whatever this collective name for the Islamic fundamentalists is going to be, managed to get inside the Pakistani military HQ. I mean, not all of your viewers maybe know what Rawalpindi means. I mean, it would be like saying they got inside West Point or Sandhurst. And remember, it was inside this same place, the Pakistanis' military elite HQ, that Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was actually found hiding in the house of an officer. So we have every right, I think, to ask the question of what's really happening to our aid money and to the political alliance that goes with it. In other words, are the Pakistanis really sincere about doing this, or are they only doing the minimum?
Right. Chris Isham, I want to switch to Afghanistan, which is the big question on the plate for the president. You've talked to the administration. Give us what they're saying and also how this might play into the president's deliberations on Afghanistan.
Well, I think the impression I'm getting, and this is still very fluid, and they're still involved in these series of very high-level meetings involving the president, National Security Council, his top advisors, and they had one last week. At the end of last week, expect they'll have another 1 or 2 this week. So it's still very much a work in progress. But the sense that I'm getting from some of the folks we've been talking to over there is that there's a real effort to try to what they call disaggregate Al-Qaeda from the Taliban, that they want to make it clear that there are 2 different networks and 2 different organizations requiring different tools to approach them. And I think this is something that we're hearing more and more of, and that perhaps this we may see something of a backing off of a full-scale counterinsurgency strategy that the president talked about back in March.
What do you make of that, Christopher, this attempt to separate the Taliban and Al-Qaeda?
Well, it's an old story. When the Taliban were in power in Afghanistan, even before the attack on our civil society in September of 2001, we kept saying, would you mind giving up Mr. bin Laden or moving him out of there? And they wouldn't do it then, and they wouldn't do it after 2001, which is why we removed them. I'm myself a bit skeptical. There is, of course, a difference, but I'm not sure how much of a distinction there is to be made between the two of them. The one is certainly the environment for the other. Ideologically, they're quite similar. And in any case, if the Taliban was to take over any part of any country, that region or that country would itself immediately become a failed state, as well as a rogue one. Often the failed state is the precondition for the roguery. So we'd be back to the same generation of the same phenomenon, albeit in a different form.
In your assessment, Christopher, of Afghanistan, the other argument, John McCain said if the president doesn't accept this troop increase, it will be a mistake of historic proportions. This notion that basically all of Afghanistan has to be pacified. Is that your view? Can Afghanistan be a smaller operation, or maybe an operation without this increase in troops?
Well, look, there's never been an Afghan government that's controlled all of Afghanistan. I mean, I don't think there's ever been one in history. Certainly the Taliban didn't control all of it. I mean, you don't have to control all of it to have a lot of influence on it. Okay, it's possible that the footprint could be less heavy. I was very interested to see in this morning's New York Times, in the very last paragraph of all, I would call it a buried lead, Richard Holbrooke saying, maybe we should stop burning their poppy crop, since it's the only thing most of them can grow. Maybe that hasn't really worked. Maybe we overestimated the extent to which that was being used by the Taliban. Maybe we've alienated the whole farming class. Well, I think that shows there's a mind at work somewhere at the administration.
Yeah,
but it's only at the end of the story that you get to it.
And that would be a major reversal of U.S. policy if that were what we were...
Yes, it would. The spirit of Richard Nixon, who launched the war on drugs, still lives. I think it's the only part of his policy that we're still wedded to.
Let me just say, in addition to that, I think that I was in Afghanistan in 2000 when the Taliban were in power, and they were the one thing that I think came away from that was that the people were terrified of the Taliban, and I think that even today you find most people, they know the Taliban, and the Taliban ruled with a iron fist and through sheer terror. The women were forced back in their houses. I mean, it was the rule of terror. And most Afghans don't want to see them come back into power. And that's a major advantage that we have going into this that I think is often underemphasized.
Yes, it's very hard to imagine them taking the cities again. I mean, they could make a lot of trouble in the countryside where people are exposed and easily intimidated. But there's been quite a big urbanization of Afghanistan, partly because of the refugees. They don't want to see these people again. There are also important ethnic groups like the Hazara and the Tajiks who are stronger now than they were, who under no circumstances would put up with a Taliban dictatorship. I think, someone said recently, we can fight as if we were guerrillas too. There's no reason why we have to be the guys in the bunkers waiting to be shot at.
Right. So, Chris Isham, from a political perspective, is that something that the problem with disaggregation, it seems to me, is that the president, as recently as 2 months ago, has argued any advance by the Taliban anywhere, leaving aside this distinction you've just made, Christopher, is good for al-Qaeda, and that's bad for us. If this disaggregation is to happen, isn't he going to have to essentially reverse what he said before?
Reverse or modify. I mean, it remains to be seen how they're going to carve this out. But it does seem that they want to restore the focus on combating al-Qaeda and perhaps downplay the focus on combating the Taliban. The question then is, are they separable? Can they be separated out? And I think that remains to be seen.
I mean, could I just add to that? You remember a few months back when the Pakistani government decided to cede the Swat Valley to the fundamentalists. Okay, you can have your Sharia law, you can do all this, as long as you don't take it any further. That was an attempt at disaggregation, it seems to me. Well, the first thing that happens is everyone who can leave the Swat Valley can and does. So there's a refugee crisis. Second, they never intended to keep their part of the bargain. They immediately started sending out of SWAT teams of people, head loppers, women blinders, acid throwers at girls' schools, all this kind of thing. And I think the Pakistani government drew a lesson from that actually, no, you can't give an inch to this kind of thing, because it leads to further terror and, of course, to total social breakdown.
I would be very careful, just to emphasize that point as well, be very careful about anything the Taliban were to say to us in terms of giving us assurances that they would not allow al-Qaeda back into the mix. Because they just, I think, I agree with Christopher, I think once you go down that road towards extremism, that all bets are off.
It doesn't, right. I want to pivot from war to peace. Christopher, your piece last week when the president was awarded the Nobel Prize, what's your opinion of the award? And also, does he still have an opportunity to make some good of it? Should he still turn it down somehow?
Well, I should preface it by saying, since you asked my opinion of the award, my opinion of it isn't very high. In the past, it's gone to Henry Kissinger, to Yasser Arafat, to all kinds of people who shouldn't have had it, all kinds of people who've done nothing for peace, like Mother Teresa, don't even pretend to do anything for peace. When her Nobel acceptance speech, she'd said that she'd discovered the main threat to world peace was abortion. A lot of the awards have been for human rights, in effect, rather than peace. That's okay. Nelson Mandela, others. In fact, there probably should be a separate award for human rights. Giving this to the president now is like giving a director an Oscar in the hope that he will make a decent film one day. It's what I described in my piece as a virtual award. I think it's a shame that he was woken up with the news. If he'd had time to think about it, he would have realized he'd missed a huge opportunity. He should have said, "It's a real honor, but I haven't earned it." And come back to me when I have really done something for peace. If he'd done that, he'd have looked like a really great figure, I think.
Yeah.
Really mature and thoughtful person. As it is, it's all sort of, oh, I can't get over the honor. Well, neither can I, because he hasn't done anything to earn it.
One of the few decisions they had to make at the White House on the fly, a lot of them they can pre-poll test and work out. They had to get to this one quickly. Chris Isham, I want to ask you, is there any damage? I mean, it's a little embarrassing for the committee maybe. The president has said, though, I don't deserve it. He's tried to pivot and say, this is really an award for, or we should use it as an award to celebrate America's spirit of volunteerism and that kind of thing. Is there any real, though, long-lasting damage in this kind of thing?
I don't think so. I think in the short term, it gives something to the comics and the opposition, something to play with. I mean, there've been some comments.
What does that make me?
Along the lines of this fellow is becoming Jimmy Carter faster than Jimmy Carter became Jimmy Carter. I mean, there have been some cracks like that. But I think in terms of long-term damage, I doubt it.
Okay. Well, last question I want to ask is, Christopher, a lot of us who've written about this Nobel Prize have played speechwriter. I want to ask you to do that. Okay, he's accepted it. He's going to give this speech when he accepts it. Is there any way he can give a speech that gets at what you're talking about, or that tries to use the platform at least for some interesting message that you would more readily approve of?
Well, given that there is this... I wish I'd had notice of that question, but hey, that's what they pay me for.
Well, I just made it up on the fly.
Look, given that there is a sort of fusion in the Nobel mind between human rights and peace, I think the president should take the most salient issue that's in front of him at the moment, which isn't actually Afghanistan, it's Iran. And to say that in Iran there's a direct connection between the struggle of the Iranian people to be allowed to intervene in their own internal affairs for a change, and the possibility of bringing Iran, not the Islamic Republic of Iran, as he's hitherto called it, because that's what stops them rejoining the family of nations, but to bring Iran back in. The two things, peace, human rights, and democracy, are really all met on the same battlefield. And we should be on the side of all three and show the connection between them. I think he could make a great speech out of that. The trouble is he'd be giving a hostage to fortune because, as he has by accepting it, because he's now judged by the standards of someone who's already a peacemaker.
Right. Well, with even less time than the White House had, you've given them an answer. Thanks very much, Christopher Hitchens. Chris Isham, thanks. And finally today, there's a top-secret facility in the Washington area where the Navy conducts classified research for the federal government. Somehow, our man, Fernando Suarez, found his way inside to give us a look behind the scenes at the unusual practice of model shipbuilding.
Inside this compound is home to some of the most classified naval research going on in the country. The Navy has agreed to allow us to take you deep below the surface, where three men have spent decades out of sight mastering the art of shipbuilding.
This used to be the bomb shelter.
Their workspace sits below a naval testing pool holding over 20 million gallons of water, which might seem like a fitting environment for maintaining and designing ships. The only problem is these vessels don't actually float.
We need a lot of space. Some of the models are very large.
That's right. This classified area is home to the Navy's extensive collection of model ships.
A lot of people have thought of this space as kind of like the warehouse scene at the end of the Raiders of the Lost Ark.
Curator Denna Wegner and his partners were all hired by the Navy 30 years ago to maintain a living catalog of the Navy's entire fleet, some 2,500 models.
The models are built at the same time the actual ships were built, so our models are generally as old as the ship, if the ship were still around.
It's an unusual craft with very little documented resources, which means finding the perfect tools and mastering techniques takes a little ingenuity.
This actually comes from a podiatrist supply, and I guess this is used to suck up toenail debris or whatever. This is a dental drill. This is actually a student dental drill. These are violin planes. Let's see what else. These are full-size spoke shaves, something you might find in cabinetry.
Now, these aren't your average childhood models. This collection is valued at $500 million. They range in size from a few inches to some that are longer than a school bus. But the number one question Wegner says he gets is, how long does it take to build one of these? Well, the answer is, it depends.
Difficult to say how long it takes because usually the models are made by groups of people. So two people working, of course, can work twice as fast as one person. We think in terms during the purchasing process of 6 months being extremely fast, a year being probably average.
Except for this Civil War replica of the USS Wampanoag.
This is all mine. It's been how many years in the progress?
22.
22 years. So the hour here and the hour there built up. It's a teaching aid. It's an experimental thing where we can test new techniques on model building so that the future model builders that come behind us will have a little bit easier job of it.
And it's future model builders that have been the missing piece for so many years. Because inside this seemingly timeless environment, there is one clock that's ticking.
Brian.
All three model builders are at the age of retirement.
Well, the Navy got real concerned about it, and there are people in the Navy that thought we better start looking at getting younger people involved in the process.
26-year-old apprentice Brian Potter is that missing piece.
I started here at David Taylor straight out of high school.
Though young, Brian is now considered the future and new face of the Navy's model ship project.
Fantastic. I'm trying to learn everything I can from these guys before one of them retire. Not that any of them have mentioned it, but...
And that's because despite that ticking clock, it's their passion for the trade that keeps them coming back, ensuring that their craft will live to sail another day. Fernando Suarez, CBS News, Bethesda, Maryland.
Thank you for watching Washington Unplugged. I'm John Dickerson. You can find us here every weekday at cbsnews.com at 12:30. Have a great day.